Welcome to part 2 of the Rendering in KeyShot Studio for Beginners series. In part 1, we covered the user interface, scene setup, and material application. In this video, we'll finish detailing out our materials, set up lights, cover camera settings and render settings, and of course, peppercorns. We need something inside this pepper mill. Let's go. All right, what else do we have here? We need to work on this part up here. I want this to be more of like a brushed metal. So I'm gonna double click on it, and we're going to add a texture to it. So at this point, I want to right click, go down to textures and choose brushed. Normally I'd use a brush radial texture for this material, but KeyShot Studio 2024.2 has a bug where that texture won't work in GPU mode on metal. So I went with the standard brushed, not perfect, but passable. From here, I'm gonna hit C on the keyboard to preview this brush texture, and it doesn't look right, but it's not mapped correctly. Again, this is a cylindrical object, so let's go ahead and change it from box to cylinder. And then we need to make it smaller. 1000 is very high, so let's make it something like 10. So we should start to see some lines here. Now we wanna hit Move Texture to make sure that this is where we want it. Let's center it on the part. And I think we need to rotate this. It's definitely not mapping correctly. So we're going to hit this green checkbox and we can go to Angle UV. This is gonna rotate it along its central axis. So if I just type in 90, this should start to go around the object pretty well. So that's looking pretty good. Let's go and scale this guy way, way down. And I also wanna make these pretty long and skinny, these brush marks. So I'm gonna go under grooves and take the length up to say 3. That's looking pretty nice. Now I still wanna make these a lot smaller than they are. So I'm gonna take the width all the way down to 1. Maybe we go even a touch smaller. I actually wanna go a little bit longer on the length. Let's go to 5. That's looking pretty good. And we'll get out of this preview with C. And I wanna plug this into the roughness, but we don't have a roughness here. Well, I'm gonna let go of this texture right in the middle of this node, and we're gonna choose roughness. That's looking pretty cool. But what I need to do is make it look, again, a little more realistic. Right now we've got really shiny parts and areas that look really rough. So I'm gonna insert a node right between here, left click, then right click, utilities, color to number. So if I hit C to preview, this output from is gonna represent these really dark values, and we want them just to be a little bit brighter than black. Otherwise, it's just gonna look glossy. So let's type in 0.01, and now they've become slightly lighter. And for the output 2, I'm gonna change this to 0.1, and we'll get out of that preview. Now this is looking a little too rough in my opinion, so we want to take that output 2, which represents the white point or the roughest part of that texture, and cut it down even smaller. Let's try 0.07, and now you notice we're getting smoother overall. And maybe the shiniest part, instead of 0.01, it's 0.02. We're just gonna bring these closer together to try to reach kind of a happy medium. We want this to look pretty shiny overall, but we also want there to be a little bit of a texture there. And we can actually also use the same texture for the bump. If we disable the roughness, right click and disable, we can use this for a little bit of bump as well. So you see here, we're actually sticking out a fair bit. That's a little too much. Double click on the texture, bring the bump height down very low, 0.1, 0.05, very, very low. Then we can enable that roughness texture once again. And I think we're looking pretty good there overall. I also think we need to maybe make it a little smaller. Instead of 1 millimeter, let's try 0.5. There we go. Now inside here, we have some shiny plastic parts that I don't actually want to be shiny. So we're gonna double click on these and add some roughness. Let's try 0.15. And then we also have the burrs on the inside. So we're gonna go ahead and double click on them because they're shiny right there. We're gonna set those to something like 0.15 maybe. Actually, let's make them even more rough, 0.2. Let's see if we're missing anything. The little metal part on the inside, we can add a little bit of texture there. So if you recall, we can hide a part by Control-Alt-Left clicking. If we zoom into this part, this central shaft here, it's going to be very, very reflective, which is not the most realistic in this case. I'm gonna add a little bit of texture here, and there's a nice way to do that. I'm gonna double click on it and pop back into the material graph. I'm gonna right click, go into our textures and grab one of those granite textures, plug that right on into roughness. If we preview that, it's pretty big. Let's bring the scale way down, something kind of like that. And let's make it kind of a black and white texture. We get out of that preview, you'll see it's mostly rough with some shiny parts. We're gonna do the same thing with the color to number node that we did before. And we're going to take the output from, which is the shiny point, and increase that a little bit. Let's try 0.02. And we're gonna take the output 2, which represents the rough parts, and we're gonna slide that down, making it more reflective. Let's bring that down to 0.1 maybe. And just by doing that, we've added enough of a finish that it doesn't look perfectly smooth. In fact, we could bring it down even a bit smaller. So let's try 0.08. And we can also go to that granite texture, make it a little smaller too, say 20. And if we wanted, we could even add a little bit of bump with that too by plugging that right on into the bump. That's way too strong. So we'll just double click on our granite. Take that bump height down to something very small, like 0.01. Even that's a little bit much. Let's try 0.005. And now we're looking pretty good overall. I'm gonna right click, show all parts. And then the other thing, lastly on this metal, let's bring it down so it's not a pure white. Let's make it just a little bit warm and just a little bit gray, so it's not perfectly white. I think that'll help. And believe it or not, with this shiny polycarbonate piece in the middle, I still like to do a tiny bit of bump on there. I know that it might seem weird, but it goes a long way in making it look realistic. So I'm gonna go right click textures and go into the noise texture. And we wanna plug that into bump. And you can see it makes the glass all wavy. When I double click on the noise texture, it's too big. So let's make it a scale of 1. And now you can see it's got this small texture. And I wanna make it just a little smaller than that, like 0.75. Cool, we're gonna make this really subtle. So bump height is gonna be 0.01, and that still is too strong. I'm gonna go half of that, 0.005. And now when we zoom in, you get this little wavy texture. And you could even add a little bit of roughness if you wanted to, but 0.001, like extremely low amounts. Otherwise, it's gonna look like a frosted glass. But that right there goes a long way in making this look realistic. Now that we've got all of our materials pretty much set up at this point, we're going to set up our shot as far as our camera goes, dial in our final lighting, and kind of bring this project to a close. At this point, let's start making this product look like it was photographed in a photo shoot. And the first thing I wanna do is actually add a backdrop ramp and some more dynamic lighting. Hit M to bring up our library. You can think of it as like M for materials. We wanna go to the models tab, and there's this cool backdrop ramp we're gonna use. Drag that right on in. I like to use this with most of my studio style renderings. And if we zoom on out, we see we have now this backdrop ramp. I'm gonna scale it down, so I'll hit S, and I'm gonna grab that cube, that yellow cube, and click and drag to make it smaller. And then I want it to snap to the ground. So under advanced, I'll expand that and I'll say snap to ground. So now if we dolly on in, we can see we have our grinder. It's still, the backdrop ramp is still a little big. I wanna make it as small as I can without it being too small. A little touch smaller there and snap to the ground. And then I wanna move it, so I'll just hit T for translate, and I can kind of nudge this back a little bit. This is gonna give us a nice, realistic looking backdrop to kind of render this against, kind of photograph it. We can also scale it down, so I'll hit S and I'll scale it just so it's not quite as tall, and I'll snap to the ground once again. So here we have our backdrop. Now the materials on it are not quite correct. We'll double click on it. I like to go with a plastic type material, and I like to make it kind of a neutral. I think I'll go a little bit dark gray on this one, probably just make it pop a little bit more, like a dark gray. Maybe a little bit blue. Sometimes I like to go 1 or 2%, and then I like to add some coolness to it. Maybe go 2%. We want to also make it rough. So like 0.2, so it's not distracting, but still has the ability to reflect some light, like a gradient, which is really nice. So notice how the product is really jumping off the page because of that darker background. We're gonna push it a step further with a couple of area lights, some physical lights. So we can go to Window, down to Geometry, and open that up. This we can dock right on top of our library of materials. And this gives us a secondary view or window that we can see our scene in. If we zoom way on out, we can actually see our camera, which is pretty cool. So we're gonna add some lights here. So if I go to Edit, Add Light, and then Area Light, it's gonna put one right in the middle of the scene. I'm gonna translate, and I'm gonna lift it up, and you see there's light shining from it, which is pretty cool. Hit R to rotate that into position. And then from the different view, I'm gonna hit T to translate, and I'm gonna move it on over. So now if I rotate it a little bit more, we can kind of angle the light so it's kind of shining where we want it. And then T for translate, I'll bring it down so it's kind of reflecting on the side of our grinder. What we can do is, if we need to, we can actually keep our view the same in the real-time view. Then we can just work in the geometry view. So if I select this plane and hit right click and then go to duplicate. Just hit OK. Right click on it again to move the part. I can move it on over. There we go. Kind of went down. I'm going to move it in the right location. I can rotate it. Again, R to rotate. And we can kind of rotate it that way, and then T to translate, move it on over. What I'm trying to do is basically point a light on either side of the pepper grinder or the pepper mill in order to give it some nice reflections. These are going to be what we call our key light. They're going to give it its overall form, and that's how it's going to look nice. Now, right now we have too much light on our product, but we're going to go to our environment that we had our HDRI in. We're going to actually take the HDRI itself and reduce the brightness. So if I turn it all the way down to 0, we're only lighting our scene. Let's go ahead and show our lighting environment with just these 2 physical lights, which is pretty cool. I want to have a little bit of an environment. So I'll type in something like 0.1, and that'll give me just a little bit more. Now, if you want more context, you could always put a different HDRI in here. One that I really like that comes with KeyShot is this Photo Studio. It's this one called HDR Maps Cyclorama. Double click on that. And if we bring it up a little bit, say 0.2 or 0.3, 0.5 maybe, it's gonna fill in some light. It's gonna look pretty good here. KeyShot's kind of like an onion. It's got layers. Today we're peeling back the first couple of them, but there's so much more than I can cover in this video. And if you'd like to work through a proven step-by-step beginner-friendly course, consider buying my KeyShot Rendering Masterclass. You'll find a link to it in the description down below. Now, let's jump back in. This is the point where I like to go into my camera and set that up for my final shot. So if I go to my camera tab, I'm going to create a new camera. Press that button on the upper left, add new camera. And if we expand all of these settings, it's kind of a lot, we can go ahead and make some adjustments if we need to. If we look in our geometry view, we can see our camera right there. One thing that I'm noticing is there's a lot of distortion on our product, and we can fix that by going to our perspective or focal length. Most products are shot at a longer lens length, so I'm gonna type in something like probably 85, and that will undistort our product and make it look a little bit more realistic, which is exactly what I wanted. I'm going to kind of choose my final angle. So I think I want to be, traditional product shot, pretty much straight on in this case, maybe tilting down just a little bit to show some of that detail in there. And then once we've got this, I'm going to go for, I can center this in the frame by turning on a grid. We can go to the grid and turn on halves. We can kind of align that with the middle of the product. And that OXO logo, I want to make sure that's really kind of centered in the middle there. I think that's looking pretty good. I can turn that grid off. So from here, we want to save our camera's position. So we'll click that save icon, and now our camera is going to be saved there. Doesn't mean we can't navigate away from it, but you see it says unsave. We can just go to the free camera and then back to camera 1, and it remembers that state that we saved it in. Now, a couple things, our lighting could be better. I'm going to make some adjustments to my physical lights, which I can do, as we know, in the geometry view. So I can right click and move that light into position a little bit better. Let's go ahead and kind of rotate it, and I'm gonna translate it around just until I'm happy with its reflection. One thing we'll notice is that it's getting cut off a little bit by the ground plane. So I may opt to move the ground plane a little bit. So if I take our ground plane and move it back, we can probably get more of that reflection from our, so we want to make sure we see the ground plane in the shot, but we can kind of still see our physical lights reflecting off there as well. Maybe I'll move it up a bit and to the side. And for the other one, I think I might want to get that into position a little bit better. I'm going to scale it up as well, kind of tall, skinny pin like that, or light. It's a little bit large, but that's okay. We can kind of move it back. I don't want them to be completely symmetrical, so I'm going to move this off, maybe go up a little bit. I think that's pretty good. Now, I don't want the logo to be dark. I kind of want the focus to be on the front of the product. So maybe I'll go this way, and I will get that light positioned so that it's actually illuminating the front of the product just a little bit better. From this point, I'm going to change the color of the lights. They're just white, but we can add some warmth by dragging this to the left. That'll, on the Kelvin scale, it'll add some orange sort of color. And then we can also take the other one and add in the other direction, a little bit of blue to cool it off. And this also helps our backdrop also picks up a little bit of that color as well, just making it look a little bit more realistic, if you will. What I want to do is address some of these blown out highlights, and we can do that in our image tab. But before we do that, we want to go to our lighting tab. We've been in basic this whole time, and by switching into product mode, we're going to get some global illumination, and that's going to let a lot of light into this product, and it's going to make this refractive material look more realistic. So we'll leave it on product mode for now, but there are more settings we could adjust if we wanted to. In our image tab, we're going to talk about some sort of post-production, some stuff that you would maybe do in Photoshop, but we can actually do it in KeyShot right here. We can also help with rendering some of the noise and some things like that. The first thing I want to do to address some of these overexposed areas is create a new image style. So you click on this button here, the left, and I'll call this Photo 1. We're going to move into photographic mode, which is going to give us the option to do some tone mapping. So this low contrast, that's a good place to start. It should prevent some of these highlights from overexposing. So if we went into the default, these are going to pure white. Photographic, it's going to gray them a little bit. Now we can play with our exposure if we need to. We can increase that. We can play with our contrast a little bit. A little goes a long way on these adjustments here. We're not going to mess with the curve for now. I do think some of these blacks are a little bit dark, so maybe I will go into the curve and I'll take the shadows and I'll go up to say like 0.1, 0.5. That helps a little bit. Now this black piece in the middle, I'm a little concerned. It's looking kind of grayish to me. So I'm going to double click on it and see what the color is. I'm going to go from 11% down to say 5%. And maybe 7%, just a little bit darker there. Okay, and then back into our image styles. A couple more things we can play with. Denoise is a good option. So this grain you see here, if I turn on denoise, it'll smooth out the whole image, but that also can come at a cost. It can kind of ruin some of your textures. I recommend keeping the denoise blend very low, like 0.5 or even lower, maybe 0.25, 0.3. And if you have little fireflies, little hot white pixels, increasing this a little bit will help as well. I don't think we need to sharpen, but it is there. Now bloom is this cool little glowy effect. If I increase this to 1 and I set the bloom radius to like, I don't know, 30, you'll see everything kind of glows. Maybe go to 50. This is good, but it's too much. So let's increase our bloom threshold so we only get this effect on the shiniest, brightest parts, like where the metal is or some of the glass. So if I increase the bloom threshold until it doesn't really affect the black parts as much, keep going a little bit, or the label. So the only parts that are really blooming are down here and up here, which is good. Now I want to take that intensity down to say like 0.5, maybe even 0.25. And now if we toggle it on and off, you can see it's subtle, but it's definitely there. I think that's pretty good. Maybe go a little higher, maybe 65 on the radius. We're almost there. We just have to discuss our render settings. And as promised, I am going to fill this pepper mill with peppercorns using KeyShot's simulation tools. Two more little things I kind of forgot, some details. Let's say I want to move this pepper grind selector so it's actually pointing at one of these dots. I need to make sure I select the part, and there's a grind selector assembly. I'm going to select that and hit Control D to move. And I just want to rotate this a little bit so at least one of those dots is right above it. So I think that looks a little more realistic. The other thing I forgot is the rounded edges tool. This allows you to take something that's got a sharp edge and add a little bit of fillet to it. So I'm going to show you this by hiding a bunch of these parts real quick. So that's Control Alt and left click. I'm going to hide a bunch of parts to expose this conical burr in here. These have too many details for me to add fillets to everything. It would have been too much geometry, but we can actually add those in KeyShot, kind of faking it. So if I take the entire assembly, I can actually apply this to everything. And if I select it and go to properties and I scroll down, underneath rounded edges, I can type in a small amount like 0.1 millimeter. And when I hit enter, watch what happens to some of these sharp cuts. If it works, it should round those out a little bit. So now it appears that those have a soft edge and light is reflecting off of it. Now this is a camera trick. It's not a actual modeling function, but I just applied that same rounded edge to every part within this entire model in one little click. You can't really do that in CAD. So this helps with rendering realism. I'm gonna right click and show all parts to bring all those back. And if I want to return to my camera view, just click on it once again, and we're back to where we were. So we've already gone through the lighting tab. This is what dictates the render settings for this real-time view. So as long as it's looking good here, it should look good in our final image. Now we just need to go to our render. And we can do that by clicking this Render Your Scene button, and that brings up our render dialog. Now I'm not gonna go through every setting here, but generally speaking, you want to choose where it's gonna render out to. So you can go ahead and change that location here. I'm just gonna render it to my desktop for now. So JPEG is gonna be pretty good, but if you really want an uncompressed image format, you can go with PNG. Creates a larger file size, but it also has the ability to include alpha transparency. Let's say we did not have a backdrop here. We could render this out where the background had transparency so that we could, say, put it on a different background. Now, KeyShot doesn't support transparency rendering on materials like this. So if you try that, whatever color is gonna be behind your transparent material is going to be preserved in the rendering. It gets nerdy, the reasons why, but just take my word for it. That's just the way it is for now. Your resolution is gonna dictate how large this rendering prints out at. So I want to have this to be a pretty big rendering, like 4K. I want the longest, tallest side to be 4K. So that means the height needs to be, I think 3480, I think is 4K. Don't go this high unless you really, really need to for some reason. Usually 1080p is just fine. Just depends on how fast your computer is and how long you're willing to let it render for. Now, when we go to our options, we have the ability to choose how long it renders for, which is gonna dictate how good it looks ultimately. I don't recommend max time or custom control. For now, just focus on maximum samples. Honestly, this is how I work 99% of the time. So how long do we need to let this sit? That's the golden question. So if I hit H on the keyboard, I get this little heads-up display that has all sorts of information on it. The number to focus on is samples. I'm at 2,300 samples right now. These go up a lot higher when you're on GPU mode than they do on CPU mode. The samples are different, so don't just copy my numbers or somebody else's numbers. I'm gonna tell you how to figure out which one to use. So if I nudge my camera, you'll see it gets grainy and the samples start over again from 0, and over time they go up. If I zoom on in, it's gonna take a lot longer to reach that high number of samples because we have more of our object to render on screen. So here's how we're gonna find out how many samples we need. I'm gonna set my camera back to what it was, and I'm gonna do a region render. Control-Shift-R brings up the region, and you can resize it and move it to a part of your image that's kind of noisy or grainy, like here. And I'm gonna wait till the grain goes away. Once it's nice and smooth to my eyes here, I will then look at the numbers in my samples and see what they say. So in this case, I think it's looking very clear right around here, and I'm looking at about 1,500 samples. I can also go a little higher than that if I want for security. Control-Shift-R will get rid of that region render. And back in your render settings, all you have to do is set that number. So 1,500 for me is where I wanted to go, and that's how I know it's gonna be a nice, smooth rendering. And lastly, we have a render queue. You can add this job to your render queue, and now you can keep on working in KeyShot. And as you add more jobs throughout the day to your render queue, you can then process and it'll render them out one at a time after you've left your computer. So if you're on a laptop or an older computer that's a little slow, or you're rendering out an animation or something really big, you can let it render overnight. I do that all the time. Just add stuff to the render queue, then process it overnight. That way you're working while you sleep. I'll go ahead and process this rendering and we'll see what it looks like when it's done. And after about 6 minutes, this is the result of the rendering. I think it looks pretty good overall. Remember that funnel we did a hide and lock on in the beginning of part 1? I planned on using it to direct the peppercorns into the pepper mill. The funnel though ended up slowing down the simulation, and I found a simpler approach, so I decided not to use it. For the peppercorns, I added a sphere to the scene and then scaled it down until it was about 4 millimeters wide. Then I hid any part that would interfere with the simulation. Next, I retessellated the sphere to reduce the number of triangles. Since I would have to simulate about 1,000 of these, I wanted to keep them as small as possible. Then I created a beige peppercorn material using the material graph. I added the single peppercorn to a new group to keep it separate from the rest of the models in the scene. I used the pattern tool to create a radial array of peppercorns and made sure to keep the materials linked. Then I manually duplicated the first array and moved it up and created a material that would be for the brown peppercorns. I then duplicated the peppercorns manually 4 more times, resulting in a stack of 256 spheres. I made sure all the brown peppercorns shared a single linked material, and same for the beige peppercorns. The pattern tool was used again to make 4 more copies of my first array, resulting in a column of 1,280 peppercorns. I was careful to save often throughout this process because the simulation tool is not very stable in KeyShot. In order to simulate over 1,000 items without crashing, I set my simulation settings really low. Maximum time was reduced from 4 seconds to 1 second. Keyframes per second was reduced from 30 to 2, and simulation quality was left at 0.1. This took a little over 2 minutes to finish. Once complete, I made some minor tweaks to the peppercorn materials. To make sure the peppercorns weren't too dark, I enabled caustics and set my indirect bounces to 2 and re-rendered my image. Congratulations on finishing this introduction to rendering in KeyShot Studio. Like I mentioned earlier, we only scratched the surface of what can be done in this video. So if you'd like to invest in your rendering skills today, consider buying my course, the KeyShot Rendering Masterclass, which condenses 10 years of my personal KeyShot knowledge into a self-paced video course that you can complete in just a few short weeks. And until next time, happy rendering.